Sammy Davis Jr. was dying of throat cancer and couldn't speak. His vocal cords were destroyed, his body was failing, and he had days left to live. When Frank Sinatra walked into his hospital room for their final goodbye, Sammy couldn't say the words he needed to say, so he did the only thing he could do. Lying in his hospital bed, barely able to move, Sammy tapped out a rhythm with his feet. And Frank Sinatra, the toughest man in Hollywood, broke down sobbing because he understood exactly what Sammy was saying without words. It was May 16, 1990, at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. Sammy Davis Jr. had been fighting throat cancer for 2 years, but the disease had finally won. At 64 years old, one of the greatest entertainers in American history was in his final days. The cancer had started in his throat and spread aggressively. The treatments, surgery, radiation, chemotherapy had all failed. The thing that made Sammy who he was, his voice, the instrument he'd used to sing and joke and charm audiences for 6 decades, was gone. The tumor had destroyed his vocal cords completely. He could barely whisper, and even that caused excruciating pain. Sammy's hospital room was private, away from the main corridors. His family had been in and out all day. His wife Altavis was there, exhausted from weeks of keeping vigil. His children had visited. Other entertainers had stopped by to pay their respects. People whose careers Sammy had influenced. Younger performers who considered him a legend. But there was one person Sammy kept asking for. One person whose visit he needed more than anyone else's. Frank Sinatra. The problem was that Frank hadn't come yet. It wasn't that he didn't care. Frank cared more than almost anyone. But Frank Sinatra, at 74 years old, couldn't face the reality of losing his best friend of 50 years. Every time he tried to visit, he'd get to the hospital parking lot and couldn't make himself go inside. Dean Martin had already visited a week earlier. Dean had walked into Sammy's room, took one look at his friend lying there unable to speak, and started crying immediately. They'd sat together for an hour, Dean holding Sammy's hand, both of them knowing they were saying goodbye, but not able to articulate it. But Frank was different. Frank and Sammy's relationship went deeper than anyone else's. They'd been through everything together. They'd fought for each other, protected each other, saved each other's lives. They'd performed together thousands of times. They'd laughed until they couldn't breathe and supported each other through divorces and scandals and triumphs. The thought of a world without Sammy in it was something Frank simply couldn't process. On May 16th, around 4 in the afternoon, Frank finally worked up the courage. He called the hospital and asked if Sammy was awake, if he could have visitors. The nurse said yes, but warned Frank that Sammy was very weak, that he couldn't speak, and that Frank should prepare himself for how different Sammy looked. Frank arrived at 5:30 p.m. He walked through the hospital corridors slowly, his usual confident stride replaced by the hesitant steps of a man approaching something he desperately didn't want to face. When he reached Sammy's room, he paused outside the door. He could hear the beeping of monitors, the hiss of oxygen. He took a deep breath, straightened his jacket out of habit, and walked in. Sammy was lying in the hospital bed, propped up slightly on pillows. He'd lost so much weight that he looked like a shadow of himself. The cancer and treatments had ravaged his body. His skin had a grayish tint, but his one good eye, the eye he'd kept after losing the other in a car accident decades earlier, was alert. And when he saw Frank walk through that door, something sparked in that eye. Recognition, relief, love. "Hey, Charlie," Frank said, using the nickname he'd called Sammy for 50 years. His voice was trying to be cheerful, but it was shaking. "I hear you've been milking this hospital stay for all the sympathy you can get." Sammy tried to smile. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. He lifted one hand weakly and gestured for Frank to come closer. Frank walked to the bedside and sat down in the chair that had been pulled up next to it. He reached out and took Sammy's hand. It felt so small, so fragile. This was the hand that had held microphones, that had danced through the air during performances, that had drummed on tables and shaken hands with presidents and pointed at audiences with love and energy. Now it could barely squeeze back. "Listen, Sammy," Frank said, and now his voice was breaking completely. "I know you can't talk. The doctors told me, but I need you to know some things, and I'm going to say them whether you can respond or not." Sammy's eye fixed on Frank's face, listening with an intensity that required all his remaining strength. "We've known each other for 50 years, Frank continued. 50 goddamn years, and you've been the best friend I've ever had. Not just professionally, not just because we performed together, but because you saw me, the real me, not the image, not the persona. You saw who I actually was, and you loved me anyway." A tear rolled down Frank's cheek. Frank Sinatra, who never cried in public, who prided himself on being tough and controlled, was crying openly in that hospital room. "You remember that night at the Sands, when those guys were going to hurt me, and you stepped between us," Frank said. "You were 120 pounds, and you told them they'd have to go through you first. You could have been killed, and you didn't hesitate. That's who you are. That's who you've always been." Sammy's hand squeezed Frank's slightly, acknowledging the memory. "And the hotel rooms I fought for you to get," Frank continued. "The racism you faced that we tried to fight together. Your wedding when almost everyone abandoned you. Every time someone tried to diminish you or hurt you, I wanted to destroy them, because you weren't just my friend. You were my brother." Frank paused, trying to compose himself, but it was impossible. "We danced through life together, didn't we? All those stages, all those performances. Vegas, New York, London. We made magic together. We made people happy. We made each other better." Sammy's eye was glistening now with his own tears. He was trying to say something, his mouth moving, but only the faintest whisper of air came out. The frustration on his face was heartbreaking. He had so much to say, 50 years of gratitude and love, and shared memories, and he couldn't say any of it. Frank saw the frustration. "It's okay," he said gently. "You don't have to say anything. I know. I've always known." But Sammy shook his head slightly. No, that wasn't enough. He needed to communicate something to Frank. This was their final conversation, their final moment together, and he couldn't let it end without telling Frank what he meant to him. Sammy closed his eye for a moment, gathering what little strength he had left. Then he looked at Frank with a determination that the cancer hadn't been able to take away. And then, under the thin hospital blanket, Sammy's feet began to move. At first, Frank didn't notice, but then he heard it. A soft sound. Tap, 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 tap. Frank's eyes widened. He looked down at the foot of the bed, where under the blanket, Sammy's feet were moving in a rhythm, the same rhythm they'd danced to 1,000 times, the rhythm that had been the language of their friendship for half a century. Sammy was tap dancing, lying in a hospital bed, dying of cancer, unable to speak. He was tap dancing. The rhythm was weak, nowhere near the lightning-fast taps that had made him famous. But it was there, deliberate, intentional, a message in the only language Sammy had left. Tap, 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 tap. Not. Frank recognized the pattern. It was from Me and My Shadow, one of their signature numbers, the song they'd performed together hundreds of times, where Sammy would be Frank's shadow, matching his every move. Frank made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "You son of a bitch," he said, his voice full of love and anguish. "You're still performing. Even now, you can't help yourself." Sammy's mouth curved into the faintest smile. His feet kept moving, tapping out the rhythm. Tap, 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 tap. It was everything Sammy couldn't say in words. It was, "Thank you for 50 years. Thank you for fighting for me. Thank you for standing with me. Thank you for seeing me as equal when the world didn't. Thank you for being my brother." It was also, "I'm still here. I'm still me. The cancer took my voice, but it didn't take who I am. I'm still the kid from vaudeville who couldn't stop dancing. I'm still the performer who lived to make people feel something. And I'm still your friend, your shadow, your brother." Frank leaned forward and rested his forehead against Sammy's hand, still holding it, still feeling those weak taps through the connection of their touch. His shoulders shook with sobs. "I hear you, Charlie," Frank whispered. I hear you loud and clear." They stayed like that for a long time. Sammy's feet gradually slowed, the rhythm fading as his strength failed, but the message had been sent and received. Finally, Frank lifted his head. His face was wet with tears, his eyes red. "You rest now," he said. "You've performed enough for 100 lifetimes. You've given everything you had. It's okay to stop now." Sammy's eye held Frank's gaze. One final look between two men who'd shared 50 years of life together. Then Sammy's eye closed, and his breathing deepened slightly. Not the end, not yet, but rest. Frank stood up slowly. He leaned over and kissed Sammy's forehead. "I love you, brother," he said. "I'll see you on the other side." He walked out of that hospital room knowing it was the last time he'd see Sammy Davis Jr. alive. Sammy died 8 days later, on May 24th, 1990. Frank was at home when he got the call. He didn't cry then. He'd already cried all his tears in that hospital room. That night, Frank had a performance scheduled at the Desert Inn in Las Vegas. Everyone expected him to cancel, but Frank went on stage. He walked out in front of the audience, and for the first time in his 60-year career, he couldn't maintain his composure. "I lost my best friend today," Frank told the audience, his voice breaking. "Sammy Davis Jr. died this morning, and I need to tell you something about him." The showroom went completely silent. "Sammy taught me what it means to be a performer," Frank said. "Not just to sing or dance or entertain, but to give everything you have, every single time, no matter what. 8 days ago I visited him in the hospital. He was dying. He couldn't speak. But you know what he did? He tap danced for me. Lying in a hospital bed, with days left to live, he tap danced, because that's who he was, a performer, until his very last breath." Frank paused, struggling to continue. "He taught me that dance isn't just movement, it's life itself. It's how we express what words can't say. It's how we connect with each other. And 8 days ago, we danced together one final time, not on a stage, in a hospital room. But it was the most important performance of both our lives." Then Frank did something he'd never done before. He sang "Me and My Shadow" without Sammy, and halfway through, he broke down crying right there on stage, unable to continue. The audience gave him a standing ovation, not for the performance, but for the humanity, for the grief, for the love. The funeral was held on May 2090 at the Forest Lawn Memorial Park. Thousands of people came, every major entertainer in Hollywood, politicians, fans who'd never met Sammy, but whose lives he'd touched through his performances. Frank gave the eulogy. His voice was steady this time, strengthened by days of processing his grief. "Sammy Davis Jr. spent his entire life dancing," Frank said, "dancing for audiences, dancing for friends, dancing through racism and hatred, and obstacles that would have stopped anyone else. He danced when people told him he couldn't. He danced when his body was breaking. He danced until his very last moment." Frank looked out at the crowd. "And I want you to know that on May 16th, in a hospital room where no one else could see, Sammy gave his final performance. It wasn't on a stage. There was no applause, but it was perfect, because it reminded me that the greatest performances aren't about the audience. They're about the connection between souls. They're about saying what needs to be said when words fail. They're about love." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "Sammy, you were my shadow, my brother, my friend, and that last dance we shared, I'll carry that with me until we dance together again." Sammy was buried with his tap shoes. His headstone reads, "The entertainer, he did it all." But those who were closest to him knew the real epitaph was written in that hospital room on May 16th, when a dying man tapped out a rhythm with his feet and told his best friend everything that needed to be said without speaking a single word. If this story of friendship, final goodbyes, and the language of love that transcends words moved you, make sure to subscribe and honor Sammy's memory by sharing this with someone who needs to hear about the power of connection that lasts beyond a lifetime. Have you ever had to say goodbye to someone who shaped who you are? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to ring that notification bell for more incredible true stories about the legends who taught us that some conversations are too important for words. They require dance.